I'm Rick Harp. This is your APTN News Brief for Thursday, March 14th. There is growing concern about proposed budget cuts at Indigenous Services Canada, more than $4 billion as of the 2025-26 fiscal year, according to departmental plans. And in a press release, Grand Chief Cathy Merrick says the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs finds the proposed cut, quote, unacceptable and irresponsible when First Nations are already in a constant state of emergency dealing with mental health and addiction crises, unquote. Just last week, the federal NDP was calling on the Liberals to reverse what they say is a $7.6 billion cut to Indigenous services in this year's budget to be delivered on April 16th. The future cuts also include the elimination of nearly 1,000 jobs at the department. Grand Chief Merrick called the proposed cuts morally reprehensible. The departmental plans include a net decrease in funding towards Jordan's Principle, and at an announcement made in Whitehorse on February 23rd, APTN News asked Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu about the possible cuts, particularly with regard to Jordan's Principle. At the time, Hajdu said it was, quote, absolutely not true, unquote. The minister said ISC had to go through the process of finding efficiencies, but that Jordan's Principle would not be touched. She added savings were to be found in things like legal fees for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal.
Jordan's Principle, in fact, is undergoing a review right now in general about how we can become more efficient because the claims have grown by 150% just over the last year, which is a good problem to have. It means kids are getting care that they need and the communities are becoming aware of Jordan's Principle and are using the program. But it is putting pressure on getting approvals through quickly, and we won't be able to achieve that if we reduce staffing. So that's not accurate, and whoever is worried about losing their job, certainly connect with the department, but that is not the approach that we'll be taking.
Unavailable for interview as of airtime last night, a statement from Hajdu's press secretary said the Liberal government has never and will not be in the business of making cuts to services to Indigenous peoples. The statement goes on to claim the department is targeting operational efficiencies, public servant travels, and departmental transformation. To Saskatchewan, where a chief with James Smith Cree Nation, site of 2022's mass stabbing attack, says they were not included in discussions about how to prevent such violence in the future. On Tuesday, a National Joint Board of Investigation released an additional 14 recommendations for Correctional Services Canada and the Parole Board of Canada. That's on top of 33 recommendations made at an earlier provincial inquest. Chief Robert Head leads the Peter Chapman Band, one of 3 bands which make up the James Smith Cree Nation.
The one thing that we were always pointing at was, justice system in Canada. 80% First Nations people in these institutions all across Canada, little supports for them when they're released from prison or jail. They don't have no homes available to them. They don't have the programs and services that they need to keep on the good path of life. They have very little in that kind of support. Plus, while they're in the institutions, they need programs and services in there too, like rehabilitation means, working with the individual on a case-by-case basis and identifying where they need help. Do they need anger management? Do they need alcohol and drug, treatment? What their specific problems is, that it should be addressed right in the institution and followed up in aftercare programs, in the community or the First Nation. And then the First Nations themselves, we need to have in order for us to provide input into what's happening with our memberships that are being considered for release. So we have to have our seat at the table, and that's something that's not happening at this moment. There's very little First Nation participation in any of the parole board decisions, and we need to have, individual First Nations represented at those tables, when their membership are coming up for parole. So those are some of the ideas that we have in regards to reform of the justice system.
To Nunavut, where the RCMP is acting on its plans to roll out body-worn cameras on its officers. The decision follows over a year of field testing, the second and final round of which began back in early February. And as part of its research, the RCMP surveyed a total of 70 people in Iqaluit back in 2020, 69% of whom favored the cameras, saying they increased their trust in police. However, the force says few of those surveyed were Inuit. There's no set time for when this will roll out in the territory. Nationally, the force is expected to procure between 10 and 15,000 body cams. And that's your APTN News Brief for Thursday, March 14th. I'm Rick Harp.